Well, today we're interviewing William H. Hamilton III, known as Little Bill, although he's not that little.
Not anymore.
So we're very happy to have you here today. I understand you wanted to say something to start out.
Well, just in form of an introductory remark, first of all, I want to thank all of those involved in the Save Ackworth History Foundation and just commend the effort that everybody's put into keeping and recording a living history of our community and our town. And I feel somewhat honored to be part of a group that's been chosen to be part of the city leaders and some of the more dignified citizens of Ackworth. And I'm kind of humbled by the fact that I have been included in that. And I'm doing this, secondly, to honor my mother and father, which were teacher and school principal to many of you. And of course, at their age, are not able to do this. So I'm kind of the surrogate coming in to fill in the shoes that really they'd want to see mom and daddy as opposed to me.
Okay, well, we're very happy to have you here. You got to Ackworth in 1959, as I understand, but you were actually from Alabama. Why don't you talk a little bit about your background in Alabama?
Okay. We moved here from Alabama when I was 2, and Mom and Daddy came as school teachers. Mr. Joe Hayes, which of course was instrumental in bringing lots of people from that particular part of Alabama, close to Selma, to this part of the country. We came here. Daddy coached at North Cobb, and he taught at Ackworth, and my mother also taught at Ackworth. So they came as school teachers during that time.
And he taught 8th grade, was that it?
He was an 8th grade history teacher, and my mother at that time was an English teacher when it was still Ackworth School, grades 1 through 8. And then later on, she stayed when it became an elementary, and he moved on from that point.
Mm-hmm. And you also were part of, I guess, Ackworth First Baptist Church when you got here?
We joined Ackworth Church, Baptist Church, because we were Baptist in Alabama as well.
Yeah.
Certainly did. Instrumental in a lot of the things that I formed as far as my life direction was actually done there as part of membership in First Baptist Church.
I just wondered how you got from Ackworth First Baptist to Ackworth United Methodist.
That was a transition that when I finally left Ackworth for a short time, with the exception of the 2 years before I came here as a child, I'd spent 5 additional years not living in Ackworth. At that time, I lived in Marietta, and the predominant church, particularly that had younger adults in it, was First Church, United Methodist Church in Marietta, and I joined that church. And when Becky and I married and moved back to Ackworth, we stayed with the Methodist Church.
Okay. And you were involved, or still involved, I guess, with Boy Scouts and lots of education type things.
I've been quite active in the church. For 16 years, I chaired the preschool committee, which we ministered to preschool needs for roughly 200 students per year. And then for 9 years, I actually was a charter organization representative. Basically, I was the go-between between Boy Scouts of America and the church, because we're the charting organization. So PAC 611, Troop 116, and the Venture Crew 1611.
Great. Well, you got here as a 2-year-old, and I guess a couple of years after that, you were in kindergarten. And tell me about Miss Irma Henderson.
Okay. The kindergarten at that time was not public, it was all private, and Miss Irma Henderson had the kindergarten, and the kindergarten that she operated is in a building that is now the pool house for Ben and Sylvia Flanagan, which are lifetime Ackworth residents.
And we've interviewed them.
Right. And Ben, of course, is a pharmacist, and Sylvia actually is a school teacher and used to teach for my father at one point. So I've known them all my life. Sylvia and I were in school together.
So kindergarten for a year, I guess, and then you started Ackworth Elementary.
Went to the Big A.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
The other Big A, huh?
Right.
I think you have some stories about what it was like to be the child of teachers in the Ackworth School.
in elementary school, it really wasn't that difficult because I didn't know any better. So in elementary school, it really didn't make a big impact on it. So first through sixth grade, Mama was just always there, and if I didn't have lunch money, it was really convenient. When the transition, the year that I went to junior high back then, which is now middle school, Daddy accepted a position as principal at Autry that year. Unfortunately for me, adolescence was zits and buck teeth and absolutely intimidated by girls. Having your daddy as a principal just simply did not work well for me. To finish that story, when I finally got to high school, I felt like Martin Luther King. I was free at last.
Okay. Well, it sounds like you had problems with other teachers too if you got paddled on the first day of elementary school.
Since Mom and Daddy were teachers, I felt superior intellectually to others, so Miss Burtz asked us all to come to the front of the class and write our name on the board, and what she was actually doing is evaluating the literacy level of us. So I went up all Mr. Smarty Pants and cursively wrote my full name on the board, and when she corrected me on it, I really didn't know any better, so I smarted off, and she took the opportunity to adjust my mentality to the school curriculum and to make sure that I was a little more respectful of my comments toward my teacher.
Something that probably wouldn't have been done with the paddling nowadays.
I wouldn't think so. Wouldn't think so.
Okay, so you went to Autry Junior High, but right when, let's see, junior high would be 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, but right when you got to the 9th grade, I gather, we went to middle school.
They changed it. I only spent 2 years, thankfully, under Daddy's domain in junior high, and they made the middle school program in the 9th grade. Was my first year that I was separated from both my parents. And as fate would have it, that may or may not have turned out very well for my disciplinary behavior.
Okay. So 71 to 75, you would have been at North Cobb High School.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Did you play sports while you were there?
The arrangement I had with my parents, any monies that I had to earn unless I was playing sports. So the first 2 years I played every sport possible so I didn't have to work. The reason was my choices for occupation were either a janitor at Ackworth Elementary School or a janitor at Autry Junior High.
I saw where you were a janitor somewhere along the way.
So that gave me the incentive to be quite the athlete, but unfortunately my skill set wasn't geared for everything. Baseball didn't work out, wrestling didn't work out, track didn't work out, so I ended up being a football player, and very proud of the fact that the senior year, football year, of course, 74, 75, we went 9-1, and the only reason that we didn't win the region is because Wheeler was doing double sessions at that point, and they had twice the amount of talent that we had, but we still did good. Win, place, or show, we had fun, and we're proud of it.
All right. So, well, we'll just go through your education real quickly. You graduated from North Cobb High School and then went to Kennesaw Junior College.
I went to Kennesaw Junior. From there, went to West Georgia. I practiced the extent of the amount of liver damage I could do for a couple of years there with the Chi Phi fraternity.
At West Georgia.
And I had a big time, but let's just say academics was only a small part of my educational process at that point.
Okay. I understand you had some of the worst history teachers in the world while you were at Kennesaw Junior College.
Well, I was very honored to have you, and I can honestly say that you did have an impact on the way that I approach history and my love for it, and the fact that on an ongoing basis I look at and study and appreciate the history, even the process that we're doing now, which is not only a history of Ackworth and our community, but in addition to that is a continuing living history of this community. I'm very proud to be part of that, and I appreciate the impact that you had on that.
Well, thank you. When did you get back to Kennesaw for your education degrees?
Once I left West Georgia, I came back to Kennesaw and took several more classes. When I actually came back and received my teaching certificate and then went back for my master's, I was in my 40s. So I had 20 years worth of a career and a wife to tell me what to do. So by the time I went back to school, I didn't have any trouble doing what the professors asked because I didn't know any better. You just simply, they asked you to do it. That's what you did.
So this is after the year 2000 then, I guess, if you're in your 40s.
It was, yes.
Or thereabouts.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes,
Okay,
yes.
great. Let's just talk about your family a little bit. We'll talk about your parents in a little while, but what about your wife? How did you? There's a story on how you met her. I know.
There is. At the time that Becky came to Ackworth as a pharmacist for Willie B. Kemp, which is an elder statesman and quite a character here in Ackworth, but he owned Ackworth Pharmacy.
We interviewed him too.
Mr. Kemp is spectacular. His youngest son and I went to school together. But Becky worked for him as a pharmacist. She's young, blonde, fresh out of pharmacy school. And I actually was a businessman in town. A partner that I had, Douglas G., and I had opened a copy machine dealership, Copy South Machines for Business, on Main Street. Everybody in town took the opportunity to introduce Becky and I and to set us up, and thankfully it stuck. So one of the true blessings from God is Becky, and I'm thankful for her every day, and the fact that we were brought together in a community setting and another Ackworth influence. Becky's from Blue Ridge. She grew up the oldest daughter of the town doctor, Dr. Zachary, on Lake Blue Ridge, and went to Tennessee, then went to Mercer Pharmacy School, and then did her residency at Piedmont later. So
Great.
very thankful for her.
And you've got two sons, I gather.
We do. The oldest son is Will, William Henry Hamilton IV, and we continue that name because it's the only one that we could really spell, so it was pretty simple. But Will was born in '96. He attended Fry Elementary, Durham, Altoona, and then he graduated this spring from the University of Alabama.
So that's why you got that Alabama shirt.
Well, that and the fact that being from South Alabama and Daddy being an Alabama graduate, there's an either-or syndrome in Alabama.
Alabama or Auburn.
Alabama or Auburn, and there's no in between. You can't be undecided. You have to declare. The Iron Bowl, which is Alabama-Auburn game, was played on Thanksgiving Day, which coincided with our family reunion for years and years. Best thing happened to our family was the game was moved from Thanksgiving Day until Saturday.
Oh, no.
So we no longer had family fights at the family reunion on Thanksgiving.
Oh, so maybe you could talk about religion or politics instead.
Yes, absolutely. Anything but.
But
But anyway, sorry to interrupt talking about Will, but fresh Alabama graduate. Second son is Joseph Max Hamilton, Monkey Boy. As a young child, he climbed on everything in the world, and even in his football career, he loved when his daddy would scream, "Let's go, Monkey Boy." But Max is currently at Alabama. He also is a Pi Kappa Phi, and he also attended Fry, Durham, and Altoona, and was lucky enough to have the great big ring. He's part of the state championship football team that they had at Altoona High School.
How about that? Well, I was just noticing too, Fry Elementary, Durham Middle School along the way, and we've interviewed Jimmy Durham for this project, but I interviewed his parents, Harvey and Bessie, years ago, right where those campuses are now.
Let me interrupt there. We live approximately a half mile from there. The Durham children and my brother and I were, give or take, the same age. We rode horses together. We played in their pasture. They played in our pasture. So the Durham family we've known literally, and actually back to Miss Irma's kindergarten. Jimmy Durham's sister-in-law was a baker from Baker Road here in Ackworth. Miss Jo actually drove us back and forth to Miss Irma's kindergarten when we were 5 years old. So Donna, the girl that's my age, we've been friends since we were 5 years old.
Wow.
And in addition to the Durham family for the two schools, the two Fry boys I grew up with, and their father was on the Board of Education for Cobb County, Mr. John Fry, but in addition to that, they had the significance of, at one point, owning the Big Chicken. So, of course, both the families from Fry and Durham, by proxy of the fact that we grew up in this community, I've known them my entire life.
Yeah, yeah. We actually have an interview at Kennesaw with John Fry years back, and also Steve Fry.
Okay. Well, Steve was a grade ahead of me, and Tim was a grade
Well, I mean,
behind
this
me.
the grandfather, Steve Fry.
Okay, okay, okay.
Okay, so your father, Bill Hamilton the second, you've talked about him as being a principal and all of that. You want to talk a little bit more about your parents?
I would love to.
Understand, I guess they still live with you?
Well, they gave me property. I live adjacent to them.
Uh-huh.
So I still live in what used to be the pasture, so I've really not moved up in life. What I've effectively done is I've moved to the pasture that I played in as a child.
But you're helping to take
Well,
care
that
of
is my primary occupation right now is caregiver to my parents. But Daddy was born in Oak Ridge, Mississippi. He was the only son with 5 sisters, and he was quite an athlete and a scholar. He graduated from high school after 11 years. His first year of college, his mother would not sign for him to join the military during the war, so he played basketball and football at Hines Junior College. After that, he left when he was old enough and joined the Navy, did his time in the Navy. Then he went to Livingston and played football, and that's where he met Mama. And then from there, he went to Alabama to do his master's. And then once we'd moved here, he went to Georgia to do his specialty in education. And as far as career paths, the only time that he wasn't a teacher or an educator in his entire life, because all he ever wanted to do was be a coach. He was superintendent for 1 year in Tallapoosa and didn't like the politics. And then for 5 years, during a time in between going to work in Georgia from having taught in Alabama, he and my grandfather Ward, which was his father-in-law, worked together in the pulpwood business for 5 years. And that, of course, predated moving here. Mama is from Camden, Alabama, which is what we consider to be our hometown. Went to Wilcox High School, which, just point of reference, is the same building that was in the movie To Kill a Mockingbird. And she and Harper Lee were the same age, and the communities were only about 15 miles apart. They knew each other and were peers back in the day.
Wow.
And then, of course, she went to Livingston, which Livingston is now University of West Alabama, but it was the state teacher school then. And that's where they met and married in 1950. And then, of course, she came here and spent 20 years as a teacher here in Cobb County. And then after that, she co-founded and operated Hamilton Frames, which is a custom picture frame shop that she and my brother Steve ran and operated.
Yeah. Say just a few words about Steve.
Steve was a little brother, of course, picked on him terribly the entire time.
18 months younger.
18 months until he outgrew me, and then we stopped fighting. The Cain and Abel syndrome went away at that point. But Steve was quite a character. He attended Kennesaw as well, and then he and Mama operated the picture frame shop. And Steve died early. He was 37. So at the point that he died, I inherited the picture frame shop. So I actually spent 8 years operating the family business there.
We talked a bit about you coming to Hackworth at the beginning of the interview, but I think maybe it's a story you wanted to tell about what actually brought your parents.
Well, I do want to talk about that. And if you look at my age and the fact that I grew up during the most active part of civil rights, in South Alabama, we lived in what is considered the Black Belt. A higher population of blacks over whites. And in 1954, the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, made a significant impact on all of education. At that point, that's pretty much when Mom and Daddy were afraid because of a county that had 7-to-1 black over white with rampant poverty and abject illiteracy. They literally were afraid to teach and stay in the system. And this actually predated the actual integration, and that's when Daddy went to work with my granddaddy in the pulpwood business. The event of Brown versus Board of Education is significant because it not only brought many other educators from that particular area to North Georgia, it brought us here. Mr. Joe Hayes, which was longtime principal of Ackworth Elementary, was from the same area. He was from the other side of the river from us. We were in Wilcox County on the better side of the river. Mm-hmm. But Mr. Hayes and his son-in-law, Henry Nettles, which is an Ackworth resident, mm-hmm. they were from the other side of the river. Yeah. But he brought us here, of course, in 1959. But the reality of it is we and so many others that were white educators, and of course, I was just a baby, but we, as the fact that our family were educators, there was a mass exodus of qualified educators that left that area mm-hmm. afraid of integration and what eventually happened. Mm-hmm. When we moved here, there was a lot smaller minority percentage in this part of the country. And in addition to that, even though there's poverty and even though there's illiteracy, compared to what it was in South Alabama, it was minuscule. This area was a much better socioeconomic area to live in, and more importantly, Georgia at that time and still pays more to their teachers and educators than in South Alabama. Mm-hmm. On an unrelated matter, but it still has to do with civil rights, Brown versus Board of Education was not affected when the Supreme Court made the decision. It basically followed 10 or so years after. Mm-hmm. When we came here, the year that I was in the third grade, there was voluntary integration in Cobb County.
Yeah, 65.
65. Mm-hmm. And almost none of the black students wanted to give up their schools and their identity. So very,
Which would
very.
have been Roberts.
Roberts School, literally just right across the holler from where we are, mm-hmm. was the black school here in Ackworth, and there was only one black high school in Cobb County, which was in Marietta, right. Lemon Street School. Mm-hmm. But there was one family only, the Clemens family, that did come here in the third grade in 65.
Went to Ackworth
Elementary as opposed to Roberts.
Right.
And then in 68, all of the schools in Cobb County were closed, and we integrated completely then. So mm-hmm. civil rights followed suit of what we did, mm-hmm. but thankfully the city leaders, and when I say on both sides of the tracks, the city leaders, white and black together, worked together to make it a smooth transition. So here we had none of the problems that were experienced by other parts of the country, and it was a very smooth transition. Side note of history, and again, this is a history discussion, unfortunate thing that happened in Cobb County, virtually no black teacher that worked in public education, that were all degreed certified teachers at the time of integration, were hired by the Cobb County school system. Very, very, very few. Over 80% of the black educators in Cobb County never were able to teach public school in their home county again from that point forward, mm-hmm. which of course is a travesty, but it's simply a reality of history.
And we have an interview with Tim Houston from his perspective of going from Roberts School to the Ackworth
And
School.
Tim was a year behind me in school, so
mm-hmm.
known him for a long time too.
And I don't think he was too excited about making the change.
He had no choice, and nobody did. His identity with his school and his friends and his peers and his teachers and what was normal and natural to him, just like every other student, was taken away from him. I mean, it was just absolutely, I can't imagine having to go through that. I can imagine moving and going from one school to the other, but not having it taken away without choice.
Yeah. I have some interviews with black educators who
right.
moved into predominantly white schools, whether it's Marietta High or
right.
up this way.
Right.
And well, it was a challenge for them, to
Right.
say the least.
Right.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Why don't we talk a little bit about your career? I think you said your first job was as a janitor.
My first job was at Ackworth School as a janitor working for Mr. Hayes.
How old were you then?
I was 14 that year.
Okay.
Alvin Hester and I worked there. His mother was a teacher along with my mother, and we worked at Ackworth Elementary, and one of our little anecdotes that we never got caught, thankfully, we would sneak a beer and a cigar occasionally on school property, but that was years and years ago, so we didn't get caught, so it's okay.
Okay.
Statute's out on that one.
Probably.
And in high school, of course, I either had to work for Daddy as a janitor at Autry Middle School or play sports, so I actually played every sport possible as often as I could. My first job out of college, I sold sharp copiers for Merchant Business Machines, and I did that rather successfully for several years.
Were you revolting against your parents that you weren't going to go into teaching?
No, I was under the mistaken impression that I was going to make enough money to rule the world, and fortunately, the snail and the tortoise always beats the hare.
Okay.
Then from there, Douglas G. and I, which was an influence on my life that we'll talk about a little later, he and I were partners, and my copier dealership, or our copier dealership on Main Street when I met Becky, when that business floundered, I worked for my childhood friends Alvin and Calvin Deemer at Day Chevrolet for a couple of years. And then my brother died, and I operated our family business for 8 years. And then when my sons were younger, they were kindergarten and school age, I actually taught school for the duration of their public school education. So we're on the same schedule as far as coming and going and days off and what have you, because at that point, Becky was working in Atlanta with Kaiser Permanente. So I was the daddy mama.
Okay, so which school were you teaching in?
Most recently, I taught at Lost Mountain. Prior to that, I was at Lovingood. Then I was at McEachern before that.
Okay, great. And so what years were those have been that you were teaching?
Math wasn't my subject. English was. I haven't taught for 6 years, so if you go back from there
13.
and back up during that time.
Yeah. Early part of the 21st century.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Why don't we talk just a little bit about Ackworth? We haven't said that much about Ackworth in the interview so far. And what was it like growing up in Ackworth?
Growing up in Ackworth, I make the analogy often, and not so jokingly, that growing up in Ackworth was like growing up in Mayberry. We were a smaller community. Traffic wasn't really a significant issue, with the exception of what's now Cobb Parkway was the four-lane highway back then, but everybody knew everybody. If you weren't part of a neighborhood, everybody knew who you were, what you were, and they looked out for you. And it was a very, very good place to be from. I can honestly say that even though I was raised in a church, I'm primarily a product of Ackworth, because Ackworth and all the citizens actually helped raise me. And, you know, I feel blessed to have the best parents in the world, but for the same turn, this community defines more or less who I am.
Well, you have a long list of people that you've mentioned or that you listed that had an influence on you. Maybe we ought to talk about some of these folks.
Okay. The unfortunate thing is the time constraints of this type interview don't allow for me to share all the experiences, but I'll briefly go through what I can.
Okay.
From kindergarten up, my best friend growing up was Alvin Deemer. We, of course, did everything that young boys would do growing up. His parents, Jack and Becky, were like surrogate parents to me, and they subscribed to the concept of they'd whip my behind when I needed it, and sometimes it did. And Alvin's grandparents, Levi and Eva Lee Day, were kind of like adopted grandparents because we'd left our family when we left Alabama. They had a significant influence on me. Levi literally taught me and and expressed and showed in his lifestyle how to live larger than life and have fun.
And they really hadn't been in Ackworth that much longer.
They
than you
came
all
the
had.
same year that we
Yeah,
did.
that's what I thought.
They came in 1959.
Uh-huh.
Another person that had significant influence on me was one of the local bankers, and he was quite a character, but Harold Harrison. He was with Ackworth Bank and then later Cobb Bank when it took it over. His son and I showed horses together, and his daughter was an equestrian rider as well, and our families were close at that time, water skied and played with them. But Harold taught me how to juggle responsibilities of life and family, and how to limit recreation, and how to be a friend. And for a formative pre-adolescent and adolescent to have an adult male that you looked up to was pretty significant, and is something that stuck with me all along.
What about Douglas G?
Douglas G, a lot of people know Douglas. Entire life was spent here. He had a deformity. He had a scoliosis of the spine that was extremely severe, and he had a humped back. And my brother and I used to joke and call him the little humper growing up, but that wasn't very nice or polite or politically correct. But Douglas taught me how one can live with a deforming disability and still assimilate socially while carrying the burden of that deformity.
Wasn't he on the planning commission?
He was. Douglas G was the first person Daddy met when he came to Ackworth. In addition to that, they were in JC's together. And then he had his finger in politics and local business affairs for many years here in Ackworth. As we move down my list, Mr. Will Joe Abbott and Miss Dixie Abbott, longtime Ackworth residents, and they literally defined Southern gentility and elegance, dignity, just absolute, just wonderful people. And their son, Bill Abbott, when he did his student teaching, taught me at Ackworth School. And
Is that right?
their family has had a significant influence on me as long as I can remember.
Well, we had a fun interview with Bill Abbott.
Bill is an absolute rock. I think the world of him. Moving further, Mr. Robert Brooks owned Brooks Garage on South Main Street. Mr. Brooks was not an educated man, but he displayed how to serve others with dignity and integrity, and the fact that he was what and who he was has had an impact on me that's positive, and I appreciate it.
Dr. Cobble.
Dr. Cobble, and of course, Dr. Cobble, friend, physician, and team doctor, turn your head and cough. But Dr. Cobble has been a fixture in the community for before we got here. The smartest man I've ever known, and also one of the kindest, gentlest people that you'd ever want to be in contact with. There's another person that may not have come up in your interviews, Brian Smith, Tobe Kennedy's stepson. When we lived on Worth Street, he lived a couple of doors down, and we played with him as a child. We were give or take the same age. But Brian Smith lived his life as a kind and loyal friend, and he lived with but was not defined by Down syndrome, and I'll always have a soft spot in my heart for Brian. There's another guy that was very significant in my upbringing, big, burly Georgia State revenuer, Mr. Audrey Fry. He looked like Mr. Clean. He shaved his head, and he was big, burly, but even though he was the epitome of a man's man, he was a loving husband, loving father, and he was my Ackworth Warrior football coach back during that time.
Now, was he related to John Fry?
Not at all. Completely different family from different parts of the country. This Audrey Fry came from North Georgia.
Okay. Joe Hayes.
Now, Mr. Hayes, Papa Joe Hayes, brought many, many of the people into this community that were educators. He was the first educator from South Alabama that I'm aware of that moved to this immediate part of the country, and his goal in life was to recruit as many of his southern brethren as possible to come here as teachers, and his second wave of recruits was not only mom and daddy, but in addition to that, it was the same year that Henry Nettles came, which eventually became his son-in-law.
Okay.
I
Oh,
do
that's
have
right, yes.
an anecdote about Mr. Hayes that I hope I'll get a chance to mention.
No, I think you,
a little later.
if it's what I think it is, that it may be about his southern roots.
Very much. We'll interrupt my influence list. Mr. Hayes was quite the character, but his southern roots ran very, very deep. Right outside of the window of his office at the old building at Ackworth School was a pine tree. No big deal, a lot of pine trees in Georgia. But across the street there was a house, and that was where, when Sherman occupied Ackworth during the war, and let me just throw out the War of Northern Aggression just to make sure it's in perspective, but they used that house as a meeting place. And as the story goes, that pine tree that was right in front of Mr. Hayes' office was the one that Sherman tied his horse to. Well, Mr. Hayes took offense to that, and in opposition to the Historical Society and or what he referred to as the Historical Society, he eased up there on a Sunday afternoon and cut that tree down because he could not have a Yankee tree in his office window.
Had to be a mighty big tree by the time y'all came on.
My memory of it, because of course I was only like not even sixth grade, I was like third or fourth grade, the tree was huge. So he held true to his roots, right or wrong, and he took the Sherman Yankee tree down.
Okay. Well, tell me about Mr. Joe Sanders.
Mr. Joe Sanders was a local man that I went to church with at the Baptist Church. He worked at Coates and Clark Textiles here in Ackworth, and he lived in the Mill Village. Mr. Sanders was a living example of kindness, compassion, and faith, and he had a significant positive influence during my formative years, and I appreciate the humbleness of a man like him. Along the same lines, my Little League baseball coach, William P. Kirby, worked for Bell South, but he had the same countenance and outlook. His son and I are still to this day very close friends, but he was a kind, good, giving person that is an example of who I've always wanted to have as an influence in my life.
Ron Clyburn?
Ron Clyburn is relatively new to Ackworth in terms of the fact that he's only lived here for 15 or 18 years. Ron is one of my best friends in the world. He and I are business partners in U.S. Arms, which is a little business that we form competitive rifle shooting clubs. He also owns and operates Foot Solutions on Cobb Parkway. He and I are both members of the Methodist Church here in town. But significant to Ackworth history, he actually he owns and is renovating a house on Dallas Street, just right around the corner from Ackworth School, 4544 Dallas Street, and doing a wonderful job, by the way, as far as restoring the house historically. It's a beautiful house.
You know how old the house is?
It predates the Civil War. Originally, the house was in 3 different sections. The front section predated the war, the other 2 after, and they're blended all 3 together. Actually, it was done before he bought it, but the front of the house he's done period, and then the rest of it they're making a modern living quarters out of it. But again, one of my best friends and a spectacular man in this community.
So tell me about Eddie Jones.
Eddie Jones is a fixture in Ackworth as well. Jones Tire has been his business. It was the old Sinclair service station before Eddie bought it and opened Jones Tire. Eddie is not only a local boy, he and both of his brothers have all had businesses in Ackworth and all been here for their entire lives, but he works hard, he treats customers right, and is a successful businessman, and he's exactly what you'd like to look at and think that all the local businesses would be like. You can trust him, and he's good folks.
How did you meet Steve Ballinger?
Steve Ballinger was my very first black friend. The reason that we were friends is because of integration. In the 5th grade, when he came to Ackworth School, we just bonded right pretty much the first day. At a time during civil rights and activism, rioting and social upheavals countrywide, Steve and I became friends, We were peers, we were equals, we were boys together, and 55 years later, we're still friends.
Does he still live in Ackworth?
He does not. He lives in Powder Springs, but he comes to see me in Ackworth.
Okay, great. Well, you have some others on your list too. Eaton's Department Store, Ron Eaton.
Ronald Eaton, of course, was the owner of Eaton's Department Store. You've interviewed his son. He and his wife were fixtures in Ackworth, and we loved to shop at their store, loved to interact with them. Going down the street north a little bit, I guess up the street, Johnny Green's owned his store, in and out of there, and knew him my whole life. Ray Tapp of Tapp's Body Shop. Alton White that had the store on South Main. I have a little anecdote about him as well. I titled it The Goldfish Bandits. When we lived on Worth Street, his store was about 2 blocks from where we lived. My brother and I, when we were little, would walk over and play in his minnow tanks where he sold minnows. An anomaly in minnows, some of them are gold. They're not all silver. So my brother and I would take a mason jar and kind of dig the orange ones out and bring them home as goldfish. One day Daddy came home
He caught you.
and asked where we got the goldfish. Oh, Mr. White gave them to us. He made us go up there and confess to being the Goldfish Bandits and ask forgiveness.
He didn't believe you when he said he gave them to you.
He knew Mr. White, so he knew better.
So you go up there and you have to apologize to Mr. White, and what happens then?
Unfortunately, Mr. White thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen, and it kind of undermined Daddy's his goal of trying to humiliate us and make a contrite heart. But anyway, it didn't work. Gene Aiken had Aiken's Gulf Station on what was the 4-lane highway, 41 or North Cobb Parkway, just a fixture always growing up. Tommy and Judd Jones. Tommy still goes to church with us. Judd unfortunately died years ago, but Nance Road is where their family property and farm was. When we were younger, we boarded horses with them during the winters. Unfortunately for the Jones family, half of what's Lake Ackworth and 100% of what's Cobblestone was family property, but Tommy taught at North Cobb, his wife Sandra taught at North Cobb, and they've been influential in every aspect of my life, and I still stay in contact with them, of course, through church.
And Butch Price.
Now, Butch Price not only is a brother from Alabama, roll tide, Butch, but in addition to that, now, Butch is a Yankee. He's from north of Birmingham. The rest of us are from...
Well, I was going to think he wasn't from South Georgia.
No. He's from... We're below the Nat line. He's up there in the hill country, so he's a Yankee.
But he went to the college.
Yes, he did. He certainly did. Significance of Butch, he and Tommy Jones during the summers worked at Ackworth Beach, and Douglas G. managed Ackworth Beach back at that point, but Butch and Tommy taught me how to swim there in that beautiful clean lake water right here on the Little Lake. And in addition to the people that I've called out individually, pretty much every resident of Ackworth, dead or alive, in and around this area have had an influence on me, and I'm thankful and appreciative for such.
Want to mention some of your fondest memories?
I would love to. Most significant is accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior at First Baptist Church. Completely the other end of the spectrum, Ray Tapp built me a 1969 Oldsmobile 442 convertible, and it was the greatest car I ever had.
Now, when you say he built it for you...
We bought a car that this would have been in the late 70s, and this car was a 69, so he took the car, repainted the car, redid the engine, the transmission, the suspension, the convertible top, and made it a beautiful, beautiful hot rod, just what every teenage boy needs is a loud, fast car.
Oh my goodness. Tell me what you love most about Ackworth.
Some of the things are pretty simple. In high school years, we, of course, had football practices twice a day. We'd sneak off to the lake and water ski during between. I mentioned earlier, Alvin Hester and I would sneak around and do some things at our summer job that we may not have needed to have been doing. Being a North Cobb Warrior, I played on our 9-1 season. The only thing that kept us from going to state was Wheeler High School. Of course, very proud moment. Graduated from North Cobb in class of 75. Meeting and marrying the prettiest pharmacist that ever been in Ackworth, Becky, and then, of course, the birth of my two sons. And another thing, fond memory, and it happens every day, being known as Little Bill. I've been known that my whole life. I'm okay with that because being Little Bill centers me, it defines me, and it keeps me in my place and reminds me of what, who, and where I came from.
Yeah, okay. Somebody we haven't talked about, Police Chief Ray Jean Cantrell. Tell me, what is the case of the skull and the firecrackers?
Okay, Ray Jean was a police chief at that time, and the case of the skull and the firecrackers. Alvin Deemer and I were driving around one night by Liberty Hill. There were a couple of boys. Terry Clark is the only one I remember by name, but they had a plastic skull on a rope, and a car would drive by, they'd pull the skull across the road to frighten people. Well, just by chance, Alvin and I had been out doing a little target practice, so we drove by. We pretty much knew who it was, but either way, when we drove by, I hung a pistol out the window because Alvin was driving, and I shot 6 times, a revolver, up in the air, and we drove straight down to his granddaddy's mailbox, put the pistol in the mailbox, circled back around. Here comes the police chief, Ray Jean. Didn't turn his blue lights on, he just flashed the lights, and we knew to stop because we knew what we had done, we just didn't know if we were caught or not. So Ray Jean came and asked us, was there any possibility that we were illegally shooting fireworks? I swear to this day, I was not shooting fireworks in the graveyard that night.
It wasn't fireworks, was it?
Absolutely not.
Okay. All right. Well, let me just ask you, how has Ackworth changed over the years, and has it been for the better or the worse?
I can honestly say all the change has been for the better. We have amenities, we have luxuries, we have restaurants, we have entertainment, we have nice roads, we have nice schools. All the change is good. Some of the resistance that I have to change and others do is the fact that what's normal and natural and what we do and see every day is what we want. But in the case of Ackworth, not so. We definitely have not only gone from being a small rural town and not far back an agricultural town, and then Coates and Clark came in with the first real industry, and then the lake recreational money has helped grow us. But in addition to that, your question, how has it changed? 75 had not opened when I was a child. 41 was the main thoroughfare at that point. The old Dixie Highway was actually originally Main Street in Ackworth, and then it moved out to being what's now US 41. At that point, it had an impact on the downtown merchants because business started moving out to the highway. Then when 75 opened, additionally, it moved more commerce away from downtown. So during the late 60s up through the early 80s, downtown Ackworth had a financial struggle to stay vibrant and to stay active. Thankfully, all of that has changed. We now have a very vibrant economy, and every aspect, every facet of Ackworth has grown for the better and improvement. Even the pedestrian bridge. We can now play on both sides of the road regardless of how many trains park in the middle of the road or how many trains are going. Of course, when I was a child, this whole organization, Save Ackworth History Foundation, originally was Save the Depot. The depot was cut in half and moved down the street. Economically and space-wise, it didn't make sense to save the depot. But even the example of the new depot and history center, that's a replica of the depot, is absolutely first class all the way. The fact that this living history is going to be recorded there for years and years to come, there's no point or facet of Ackworth that I don't think has improved with the change and with the times.
Right. Well, I know you've thought about going to other places, but you're still here. Want to talk about that a little bit?
Briefly, the places I may go. Becky's from Blue Ridge. At some point, we may build a second home in Blue Ridge so she can be close to her family. We dream about the Georgia coast, the marsh and the salt water and sand. We've got a family place on Lookout Mountain, Cloudland, Georgia. We've got acreage and got a cabin. Maybe we can start spending a little more time there at some point. Maybe we can do exactly what we're doing. Follow the lead of what Dorothy had to say in The Wizard of Oz. There's no place like home. Being from the best city in the universe with the best people and the best influences, there's no place like home. I think I'll stay here.
All right. Well, maybe that's a good way to end then.
It is. Thank you. Ackworth is who and what I am. I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you for allowing me to contribute to the ongoing living history of our great city, and I sincerely hope that this process never ends. Thank you for your time, and thank you for allowing me to be part of it.
Thank you.